All right. Hello, everyone. You should be able to actually see me and hear me. Let me know if everything's fine. Just put plus in the chat. That'd be super helpful. Um, yes. All right. Awesome. Great. All right. Let's start. Let's begin. So today is our lesson number 13. And today we're going to continue talking about our interview preparation and actually interview related topics. So today we're going to go over our questions, the questions that we have left from the last session. We will also spend some time and talk a little bit about testing types because it is super important to remember them as well, especially because your interviews are coming soon. So it'll be helpful for us to refresh them. And then we will talk a little bit about the process. So hopefully you will have some understanding on where is QA actually in the process, in the whole process of software development. How do we communicate with other team members? When do we communicate? What kind of meetings we have, and so on. So let me start. I'm going to start simply by sharing my screen. As always, please also let me know if you can see it. And ideally, you should be able to see it. So if you can put plus in the chat, that'd be great. Let's see. Okay. All right. Thank you. This is great. Very cool. So quick comment over here. As always, I'll be stopping after covering certain topic. So if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat and I will make sure to also answer them as well. All right, very cool. So let's begin. Actually, we're going to start with a few questions that we have left from yesterday. So yesterday we were answering interview questions, and the last one was, I believe, number 8. Why did you choose to become a QA engineer? And I think I mentioned that it is pretty generic. So you can really modify this answer for yourself. But the next question is question number 9. So why are you leaving your current company? And this is a very popular one. In fact, this is the question that I hear at least once during the interview process. Usually I hear it couple times because it definitely appears with HR screening, with the very first stage. It usually pops up during the conversation with QA manager or whoever wants to hire you. And sometimes it can also pop up during on-site with just some other folks as well. So why are you leaving your current company? There are a lot of things that you can say. There are obviously no right or wrong answer. It's really a person's choice or preference what to say. But let me just give you a couple of ideas. So if we are going by HR book and actually find this question there and try to understand what is the ideal answer. The ideal answer for every HR to hear from you is that you're looking for a change because your current environment is not challenging enough for you because you grown to the level where there is no way for you to continue growing at where you at your current state, right? So when answering this question, keep this in mind that a good answer would be to mention something like, at my current project, there are pretty much everything that I could learn, I've learned it, and I would like to get into more challenging environment. I would like to work maybe on larger product. I would like to work on more technical things and so on, right? So this is the ideal answer. Of course, this is obviously not the only answer. Another possible answers you can give here, why are you leaving your current company? Well, because I'm on the contract position, my contract will expire in 1 month, in 2 months, and I'm looking for a change right before my contract ends. Another good answer, also very, very popular. Another example for you is offshore teams. So as you may know, QA is actually something that can be given to an offshore team. QA is very often given to folks somewhere in Eastern Europe or in India or in China and so on. So you can answer something like, my company is moving QA to the offshore team, so I'm looking for a change, right? No right or wrong answer, just pick your own and basically try to stick with this. So make sure you sound confident and make sure that when answer this question, you don't sound surprised, right? This is the question that pretty much every person, every HR at least, is definitely gonna answer, definitely gonna ask you. Okay, cool. The next one is what can you bring to the company? So this one is a little bit hard usually for people. I'm not sure why, but when thinking about what can you bring to the company, think about your knowledge, think about your technical skills, and think about your personality for sure, right? So at least you can mention that you have some experience working with mobile testing and working with web testing. So you can bring your experience, you can share the knowledge for sure. You can definitely mention things like, I can bring good attitude, I'm responsible, so the project will be in the good hands as well. And very generic things like good energy, you can definitely mention that as well. Just don't pick one item, better just give us a whole package. So you can say something like, I have some experience working with such and such technology, so I can definitely work on this and hopefully improve your testing coverage. I am very detailed oriented, so I'm sure I will find a lot of issues and hopefully also improve your user experience. And help you to fix these issues. And you can definitely mention something like, I'm a good team player, so hopefully I will bring a lot of good energy because I like to communicate with other people, I like to work on the team, and so on. Right? So that is just a very generic answer. Of course, you can modify it depending on the role. If role is requiring IC, like only individual contributor, and there is, for example, no team at all, you can also mention that you are very independent and you can actually work on the project without needing a lot of supervision. That is also a good side. All right, question number 11. What is your strengths and what is your weakness? So for strengths, it's usually an easy one. You can mention a lot of things such as being detailed oriented, being reliable, responsible, and so on. What is your weakness is the question that is usually very hard for people to answer. So the approach I usually recommend people to take is this. When thinking about your weakness, think of something that is true. It is QA related or your field related, but at the same time, it's not something that is required for the job, and it can be possibly improved, right? So a good example here would be, for example, test automation. You can say something like, well, I don't have any experience working with test automation yet. Also, I think it's an interesting field. I may even take some classes because I'm really curious on what it is. But I consider that's one of my weaknesses as a QA engineer, right? You can mention this. And when answering, notice that when giving you this answer, I also mentioned that like I may take some classes, or maybe you can say like I'm already taking some classes if you are, or if you saw a couple videos on YouTube about what test automation is, you can say that I started to take some classes, right? And that phrase will show that you are actually working towards improving this weakness, right? Towards basically fixing it, right? So you can definitely use this as an example. Test automation is obviously not the only thing. you can mention anything else. Just try to avoid something that is very related to this job, right? So if this job requires you to have a lot of testing, do a lot of testing on web, definitely don't mention any weaknesses that are related to web testing. If this job requires you a lot of testing on mobile, you can definitely say something like, well, I have a lot of experience working with mobile. At the same time, probably my weakness would be that I don't have such wide experience testing on web yet. So that is my professional area that I believe can be improved. And again, you can mention that you've taken some classes at school about it, and you are learning that as well. All right, let me quickly look at the questions because I think I had a few in the chat. Okay, just reading the questions, thinking about the most relevant ones. I'll take them first. Um, okay, so first of all, let me start from the last one. Can my weakness be English language? So I usually recommend people not to mention English as a weakness, simply because the work of QA requires a lot of documentation. So, for example, writing bug reports, it is a document. Creating test cases, test plans potentially, or checklists, that is also a document. And the good skill here is basically to explain what the issue is or what the steps are in the terms that other people will understand. So English is kind of important for a QA related field. I'd probably avoid mentioning English as a weakness. Also, it really depends on the way you actually serve it. So if you say something like, I wish my English was closer to the native language, to the native level, and I'm also taking some additional English classes to improve it. Uh, that is a good point. That sounds okay. That doesn't sound bad at all. But at the same time, if somebody is asking you, what is your weakness? And you say, I believe my English is bad, that doesn't sound so good, right? So they may be worried that you won't be able to create documents very well and things like this. So be very careful about this one. Okay, let me go back a little bit. Somebody is asking, this is related to question number 9. Why are you leaving your current company? If you are telling that you're leaving your current company because you're on the contract and your contract is about to be expired, no, they will not ask you to show any contracts, or they will not ask you to show any proof. You can say whatever. So don't worry, nobody's going to ask you about the contract at all. Okay, let's see what else. Okay, so I don't see anything else that is related to these questions. I have a couple more. I'll answer them after the last one. So what would you do in case of personal conflict? So this is another one. It is pretty common. Sometimes I hear a variation and I hear something like, have you ever had a conflict? Can you maybe give me an example of a conflict or issue that you had? So if you are asked this question, please try to avoid actually speaking about real hard conflicts that you had with somebody. So another tip here is, if you're answering this question, always keep in mind that you have to mention the solution. So even if you are given an example of a conflict, you decide to go that way and just be honest and give a real example of a conflict, don't forget to mention solution at the end and mention how this conflict was resolved, right? Because you want it to look good and you want basically to look responsible, and that the conflict actually get some resolution. So how I usually recommend to answer this question is like, fortunately, I didn't have personal conflict experience. I usually get along with people pretty well. At the same time, if I ever had a personal conflict, I would, first of all, try to talk to individual whom I am having the conflict with, and try to understand why is this conflict happening. Then, if we talked this through, and I understand that nothing is happening and looks like we are still not having good relationships, I may actually go to my manager or go to HR and actually just ask an advice on how should I behave in a certain situation. So I'm not going to file anything officially. I'm just going to ask an advice because maybe they know how to work with this particular person, or maybe they can recommend me a solution. They probably worked with this person for a longer period of time. Maybe there is like a personal issue going on with this person that I'm not aware of, and so on. So they usually can provide some feedback and some insights. And I will try to basically get an advice from them, and then talk to the person again or follow this advice. If this doesn't work at all, then I will just talk to my manager and try to ask some help from my manager and help me resolve the issue, right? So what they want to hear is that, first of all, you are going to talk. You're not going to just like sit quietly and not do anything. And secondly, that you are actually willing to resolve this conflict. Um, Similarly, if you decide to actually mention a real conflict, like let's say at my past experience, I had a conflict with my colleagues because of the approach to testing something. If you're mentioning something like this, always mention the resolution. So always say that, like, we eventually talked this through, we decided to use these tools and these tools and something like this, right? So definitely mention that that got results somehow, because it just looks much better. But again, I personally usually don't recommend people mention the conflicts that they had in the past, because think about people who interview you. They potentially just want to avoid somebody who may have a conflict, right? And they just probably not willing to take a risk. Okay, cool. So let me look at a couple more questions and then we move to today's topic. So something is a little bit unrelated, but I'll answer this. How much more difficult is automation QA compared to manual, and the pay difference between these two? So automation can be very different. It can be automation of just UI, user interface with web or mobile. It can be automation of backend services. It can be automation of like pretty heavy platform services, integration tests, unit tests, and there is a very huge land over there. So the difficulty depends. In my opinion, UI automation, which is test automation of interfaces, is not very hard, but at the same time, I have over 5 or 6 years experience with this, so probably my vision is a little bit broken at this point. So usually it takes us about 5 months to actually teach somebody test automation from scratch. And it does require a lot of programming and knowledge of algorithms and at least some basic concepts of computer science. So if you tried coding and you feel like you're getting it, it probably won't be very hard for you. At the same time, if coding is hard, and for some people, it actually is very hard. And just like a rocket science, it will probably take you longer to actually get it, understand it, and learn it. The pay difference is basically also depends on test automation. I've seen test automation engineer making $100,000. I've seen test automation engineer making almost $300,000. It really depends on what kind of test automation you're doing on your level. In average, if you're just talking, let's say, take middle level, let's say UI automation, just for the sake of example, it will be around 140 in the Bay Area, right? Somewhere else, probably a little cheaper, but in the Bay Area, around 140 to 150 you can definitely get for user interface automation, which is basically Selenium and something else. Okay, cool. And let me, I guess, answer one more. Is that yesterday we were talking about checking if the bug has been already reported. Do we need to check it every time we report a bug? I usually recommend you, when you file a new bug, let's say you are new to the project, you don't know very well what was reported, what was not. If this is the case, just double check with in Jira, make sure that you're not creating a duplicate, right? If you have some experience with this project already, you've been on the project, for example, for 1 or 2 months, by this time, you're pretty much familiar with majority of your most common bugs. So at this point, if you feel confident like that this particular bug is new, you don't have to check. That's okay. Okay, cool. So let's move on, and let me actually move to today's topic. I think there are a few more questions. If we have time, we'll get to them, but let me actually start with today's topic so we are not behind. Okay, so today, first of all, we're gonna start with talking about types of testing. And let's just quickly go over them one more time. Actually, let me share it first. You definitely covered types of testing before, but we also included them at the very end simply so you can actually refresh the knowledge and you know and remember what types are most common, and you don't mix up the definitions. Okay, so I just sent you the link. It is actually in the chat, and let me start by presenting. So types of testing, let's quickly refresh them. Types of testing, there are a lot of different classifications, right? So the most common one, the one you are probably all familiar with, is that testing is separated into 3 different types: black box, gray box, and white box. So what is the difference? The difference here is the approach to the software that you are testing. So if you, for example, have no idea about the internal structure or about any internal details of your application, and just take your application, install it, and interact with us, this is black box testing. And black box testing is basically what we as manual QA engineers do pretty much 90% of the time. So we're just simply going to install the application on our phone or open the web page, interact with something like, for example, click buttons, input something into fields, and just verify that functionality of our application is working. We're not going to go check what kind of requests is being sent to the backend. We're not going to check what kind of information is stored in the database, right? We're just going to open the page, interact with this page, go over it, make sure that it is matching what we have in requirements, maybe reports and bugs. So this is black box testing, right? Very high level. We're not looking at any internals. So black box testing. Now, imagine that you actually doing a little bit more than this. For example, you are creating a user and you verifying that, first of all, you can log in as this user. This part is still black box. But then also you want to make sure that user information has been stored in the database. And then if this is the case and you can actually log into the database and verify that the user was created, This is gray box testing. So you are moving from like zero knowledge and like zero insights of your application to actually to the point where you have some knowledge, right? So gray box testing is when you have some knowledge about your application, when you have some information about its internal structure or services, you can access them in order to verify this. This is gray box testing. So a good example of gray box is actually going to database, making sure that data is recorded in the database. Another example of gray box testing would be to verifying the API calls that your application is making and matching them with the requirements on the backend side. This is a little bit higher level, but it is also possible. Usually, from my experience, manual QA engineers don't go in the gray box testing uh, basically anywhere behind the database. Like usually everything gray box here is that they verify the data is stored in the database. Maybe some people will do some API testing as well, but that's basically it. And usually this type of testing is probably maybe 10% of people's time. The majority of testing is still done on this side. So gray box testing is when you have some knowledge about the internal structure of the application or its algorithms, and you can actually use it in order to test things. Now, white box testing, or some people call it clear box testing. This is when we actually know everything about the internal structure. We know it to the point where we can even see the code written and we can write tests for certain functions in the code. So this is done by developers. Usually QA engineers never touch it at all. Sometimes some test automation engineers can touch this land, but again, it doesn't happen often. Usually it's done by developers, and the good approach is actually this testing to be done by developers. So even when test automation engineers are doing some white box testing, that's actually not correct. It should be done by developers, ideally, in the ideal scenario. Okay, cool. Let's see. Somebody's asking me, is a PT team test the gray box? Please let me know what PT is. I'm not sure I'm following. Okay, but while this is clarified, let's move on. And the next classification I have is we split testing in two major groups, functional and non-functional. So functional type of testing is a type that verifies that each function of our application behaves as expected according to requirements. All right, so what we're going to be doing here, we will take our application and we will basically just interact with this application in order to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So a good example here, for example, online store. You open the application, you go navigate through the store. This is functional testing. You make sure that you can select products, add them to the cart. That's also functional testing. You make sure that you can make a payment and so on, right? So all of those are going to be functional testing. Non-functional testing is type of testing that we use in order to verify non-functional aspects such as UI, performance, usability, and so on. So a good example here, for the same online store, you have a design. And in the design document, it's specified that the font here should be black. The background color here, for example, should be white. This button should be in the middle, located in the center of the screen, and it should have a certain color, right? So non-functional testing in here would be verifying the graphical user interface and making sure that font is really black, background is correct, and it has correct white color. The button is located and aligned properly in the middle of the screen, and it has correct color. So this is example of non-functional testing. Other kinds of non-functional testing are performance, usability, reliability, and so on. These types of testing usually are not done by manual QA engineers. So things like usability can be tested by designers. Things like performance can be tested by either automation engineers or developers. So they basically devoted to making sure that your application loads fast enough, user can interact with this without any issues. But those are also types of non-functional testing. Okay, let's move on. And let's talk about the next one. So another classification that I have here is separate testing into positive, negative, and boundary. So let's talk about those. So positive testing is a type of testing that we are doing by inputting the valid data. And we have to make sure that our application behaves as expected when we input correct data, valid data. So for example, you are creating a user somewhere on the somewhere in your application, and a positive test case would be to go to the registration page, input valid first name, valid last name, valid email, valid password, and for example, valid country, like let's say it takes 5 fields. So positive test case would be just to input this valid information, click register or submit button, and then make sure that this user was successfully created. This user can log in. And when you go, for example, to user profile, you see correct first name, correct last name, correct email, and so on. Right? You obviously verifying that password is correct simply by entering it when logging in as well. So positive testing. We do positive inputs. We verify that application handles it as expected. Second type here is negative testing. So negative testing is a type of testing that is basically trying to make sure that your application behaves as expected when you are doing unexpected behavior or when you are inputting invalid data, right? So this type of testing is basically trying to make sure that your application can handle all the error cases. It can handle unexpected user behavior. It can handle invalid inputs. So if we're talking about registration as an example, negative test cases for registration would be, let's say, don't input first name if first name is required, or input numbers instead of the name, and then try to register. If this is the case, your application should actually show you an error message and say like, hey, this first name is invalid. Enter invalid email, or don't enter email. And your application should also handle these cases and either tell you email is required to register, or valid email or valid email is required to register, and so on, right? So your application handles all these cases. And now another type here is boundary testing. So boundary testing doesn't fall into category of positive or negative. It's actually a technique that combines both positive and negative cases. So for example, you need to test an input field. And in this input field, you are testing user's age. So your user can create a profile in your application if this user, for example, over 18 years, for example, 18 years old and over, or for example, if this user is below 150 years old. right? So user cannot register if user is 17 years old, which is basically below 18, and user also should not be able to register if he or she is older than 150 years old. So boundary testing will be testing that basically test for these particular boundaries and verify that your application handles this range correctly and behaves as expected. So in order to do boundary testing for this particular example, what you should be doing? At first, you should verify positive checks and do positive checks. So what is our lowest range for user to register? It is 18 years old, right? If user is less than 18, user cannot register. But if user is 18, user should be able to register. So we take 18 years old. This is our first test case. We verify that user can create a profile. Then we take the upper border, 150. So we take 150 and we verify that user can also create a profile. And then it is a good practice to take any number in between. So take 20 or 30 or 40, whatever, just pick one value and create the user who is, for example, 30 years old. And make sure that user can be created. So that is basically positive testing for these boundaries. And then you also want to test negative cases as well. So if your registration form tells that user should not be less than 18 years old, take 17 years old, try to create a profile for a user who is 17 years old, and then verify that this profile cannot be created. You see proper error message. And then also take 151 and make sure that you also cannot register because it's basically too old, right? So boundary testing is this testing around our borders. So the bottom border in this example is 18. So you take 17, make sure user cannot register. You take 18, make sure user can register. Then you take another border, 150, verify we can register, 151, verify we cannot, and then take one in between two borders just to make sure it's still working. So boundary testing is basically this testing technique in which the test cases are just designed to include values at the boundary. And age here is a very common example. So if you are ever asked to give an example of boundary testing, just mention this, feel free to mention this. Okay, let's move on and let's go to the next one. So next slide. I'm not gonna actually go into a lot of details here, but let me just explain you and quickly refresh it on a high level. So unit testing, integration testing, systems testing, acceptance testing. This classification takes testing from like component perspective, from the very small one, which is a unit, to the large one, which is acceptance. Acceptance is the testing of the whole application. So unit testing is a very low-level testing where the individual units are tested. Individual units can be, for example, a function inside the code of your application. Unit testing is done by backend developers, and it should be done by backend or front-end developers, and it should be done by developers only. It should not be done by QA engineers, automation engineers, and so on. It's literally, you actually write the test cases in the code of the application. And when you build the application, these test cases get executed first, and then the application is built. But you probably don't even need to know this information. This is just more for the background. So very, very low level testing. Integration testing, we go one level up, right? And at this point, we combine individual units and we test them as a group. Again, this is usually made by developers. So for example, we have a backend service that needs to connect to the database and get user information. So the backend engineers will write test cases that will connect to the database and verify that they can get information and the information they receive actually matches what they expect to see, right? So integration testing, couple of units, couple of things are combined, so it's a little bit a higher level than unit tests. Let's move on. So next one is system testing. So system testing is process where we take different components of the system and we test them in a full, like making sure that it is actually working as expected. So for example, we can go and actually test the component that is responsible for user creation. So we go to the website, we create a user. This user needs to be basically over like this HTTP request response method, as we talked about a couple of lessons ago. This user data needs to be sent to the server side. Then server side records this user information in the database, and the whole thing works together, right? So system testing is this level when we actually verifying that these components, they all work together, right? In here we have front-end code where users, like, or client side, where users would input information. We have server side that would actually get this data and try to work with us. We have the database, and the server should talk to the database, record user information, make sure it's recorded, and send back information to the front end saying like, hey, user got created, right? So system testing, all these components, they all work as a whole. Okay, and the very high level is acceptance testing. This is basically where most of the manual QA engineers work with. Like, this is the level where we usually appear and do a lot of jobs. This is a very high level, and this is when we basically test the whole system, the whole software for acceptability. So basically we verify that the whole application matches our business requirements and can be delivered to our users. So let's say we build a few features, we take our whole application, go through it, test it, accept it, and then it gets released, right? So very high level acceptance testing. Now a little bit more about a couple other things that you can hear. So alpha and beta testing. Probably you've heard some of them, some of these words before, but both of these types of testing, they are acceptance testing. So they are subtypes of acceptance testing. And both alpha and beta testing usually require some external testers, and these types are not necessarily will be performed only by QA engineers. They can also be performed by other users and other audience. So for example, alpha testing is, let's say your company is building a product, and now this company wants to release this product to the audience for the first time. But they are not sure if actually people gonna like it at all, if people will be able to use it at all. So alpha testing is this initial stage where the product is released to the group of internal users. So usually when product gets through a lot of testing through QA, when we really sign off and decide, okay, we are pretty much ready to go to the public audience. If we want to have some additional testing here, not everybody wants, but if we want to, we can also basically have a stage of alpha testing. At this point, we will give our application to our internal employees of the company. So for example, we can give it to marketing, to finance, to customer success, to whoever. Sometimes people also give application to family members of people who work for the company. And now everyone from this group can download this application and play with this a little bit or use it or whatever. So alpha testing is helpful because we have a bigger pool of users, like this internal testers. They have different devices, and we can actually make sure that things are working properly for these internal users before we release, right? So again, alpha testing is usually done by internal group of users. It will probably also include QA engineers as well, but this is not the stage that will always happen. Companies actually pick if they want to have alpha testing or if they don't. Now, beta testing. So sometimes when we release the product, we are again not sure if the product's good or not, what is the quality of the product, and especially if our company has a huge pool of users, we actually want to have a larger audience that will test for us. So this is a very common case for gaming industry. Imagine if you work for a gaming company, they have thousands of users. These users are using different devices, they are on different Wi-Fi, on different network, in different locations, and so on. They have all possible different screen resolutions and so on, right? So if this is your case, you probably want to make sure that you won't break a lot of things for these users when releasing the application. So beta testing is when we release our application to the group of end users. They're not internal employees, they are end users, but this is a very limited set of users, a very limited group. Let's say we release it to 5,000 people. And then this is the stage where this 5,000 people can actually get access to the application, to the game, for example, test it, and provide us with the feedback or with issues that they discovered. Then we go fix the issues and we are more prepared for the release. So just to reiterate, alpha testing and beta testing are both types of acceptance testing. They are not necessarily done by QA engineers. QA engineers usually are part of alpha and beta testing groups, but there are a lot of people besides just QA engineers here. And these stages are not required. So companies pick if they want to have the stages or not. Usually this kind of testing is done before major releases of a certain feature or a first release of a product in order to make sure that we are actually safe and not delivering something that is broken for the end users. Okay, let's move on. And one more, end-to-end testing. End-to-end is also a subtype of acceptance testing. So end-to-end testing is a technique used to test whether the flow of application right from the very beginning till the basically end. Some people call it full user journey. So the purpose is to make sure that actually our system behaves properly from the beginning till the very end, and that the data flows from different components of our system without any issues. So for example, if we are talking about online store, end-to-end testing would be to open, let's take Amazon as an example. To open Amazon.com, go, let's say, to the search bar, input something, let's say phone, go to the products, find, basically add one of the phones to your cart, then purchase this phone, like make the checkout, make sure that your information is stored properly, like you actually seen the address correctly, you can do the payment, and at the end of this, log out, right? So basically from the very beginning, from user creation through the whole journey of actually purchasing something, and then verifying that your information is correct, right? Probably at the checkout information, your address or your username should definitely match the username that you entered during the registration, right? And this is the way to make sure that the whole thing actually works while we go from one screen to another and while we go through the whole system. So end-to-end or full user journey. Okay, and before I get here, let me quickly look at the questions and then we'll talk about these types. Okay, let me quickly read them. So first of all, is performance testing team the gray box testers? Usually they are. Yes, because usually when you test performance, such as actually making sure that your request response time is correct, you need to have some knowledge of APIs. So usually that is more towards gray box. If you're talking about user interface and loading and components, you probably want to have access to the interface side code. So I would say that performance testing is more on the gray box. Okay, another one. Is beta application tested as initial stage before releasing to limited amount of users, before releasing actual application to find bugs? So this is how it's usually done. We work on the product or on the feature of a product. We build a feature. We test the feature internally with like QA engineers, and then we release it to beta users. It can be just mass audience as well, but to limited number. So for example, users who, if it's a new product, like let's say we limit it to 5,000 users. So first 5,000 users can actually download our app, play with this, provide us feedback, and then we just simply wait and we watch the feedback that we are getting back from the users. If everything is fine, we can just release it to the rest of the audience. And that's basically how it is done. That's one example. Another example, we actually have a pool of beta testers. So let's say we already are a known application, we have released our product, but we are building a new feature. And now we don't want to release this feature to everyone, but we would only release this feature to, let's say, 5,000 users. And then we wait from their feedback, what we get, fix it. And after everything is fixed, after we understand that, okay, it's good, then we release to the rest of the users. So that's usually how it's going. Okay, and another good question, does end-to-end testing have negative test cases? So usually no. If we're talking about end-to-end, it's basically full user journey. So our purpose here is to make sure that the whole application behaves properly from the beginning till the end. So we usually don't do negative test cases here. So we just do the full flow. And that's the whole reason, to make sure everything is working properly. So it'd be definitely on the positive testing side. Yeah, negative tests, they are smaller. They would be to a certain function probably. So I can't imagine negative tests being a part of end-to-end tests, because that would break the flow. But it's a good question, actually. Let's move on. So the next one is types of testing, and we breaking it into regression, smoke, and sanity. So let's talk about it. And then we'll talk a little bit more about process today, and I'll also come back to this as well. So smoke testing. Smoke testing is a type of testing that we perform after we receive a software build to make sure that the critical functionality of our application is actually working as expected, right? So the idea is that you don't want to test the application that is broken to the point where users cannot log in or cannot register or cannot make a purchase, for example, right? And if one of those critical components of your application is broken, mm, there is no point to retest the whole app because this build needs to be fixed anyway, right? So small smoke testing basically tries to prevent us from this excessive testing of the whole application that we don't need. So during smoke testing, we will get a software build and we will quickly go through the major functionalities. So user registration, login, log out, making the payment if it's a pay, like if it's, for example, a store or payment is part of this application. Making tests for some major functions. So for example, if it's online store, making sure we can see the products and making sure we can add products to cart, right? So very, very key area tests. And basically, we want to make sure that this core critical functionality works, because if any of these features doesn't work, it basically means we need to fix the build before we do the whole regression testing. So this is smoke, quick initial testing. Sanity testing. Same idea as I just mentioned with smoke, but the difference is that sanity testing performed after receiving a software build with changes to make sure that the functionality or bugs have been fixed and no other issues introduced due to these changes, right? So sanity testing, we basically take the new build. Let's say this build has a bug fix. We take the new build and we quickly make sure that, first of all, users still can log in, log out, make a payment, and so on. But also we go to the functionality that had a bug and quickly check, making sure that it is working and the bug is fixed. That's it. Nothing else. So very, very quick verification. Regression testing is a type of testing that we perform in order to make sure that any recent code changes or any recent fixes, for example, don't introduce bugs to existing features. So this is done in order to make sure that bug fixes, for example, or any code changes don't break our existing functionality. So what we are going to do during regression testing, we're actually going to go through the whole application and verify that all old functionality still works and it is not broken after the changes has been implemented into the build, right? So this is going to be actually going through the whole application and executing a lot of test cases and going basically through pretty much each and every feature that you have. The difference here and here is that sanity testing is like really quick. We just take build, quickly verify some things, making sure that the functionality around the bug fixes is working, things are fixed. Regression testing is more fundamental. This is when you take the application, test all its features very carefully, including the features with changes, and make sure that everything is working. Okay, so let's see. Let me quickly look at the questions and we'll go to the next one. Smoke testing means testing the initial steps of each functionality. Not exactly. if your functionality is not critical, it usually is not a part of smoke testing. So for example, let's say you have Netflix and you can favorite your shows, the ones that you like. So favorite functionality is not critical. It's not something that must be totally like 100% working in order to for us to actually test the rest of the application, right? So in this, if this is the case, we are not going to be testing favorite, unfavorite thing in the smoke test. But we will definitely test features like login, logout, watching a video, and for example, navigating through search. And making payments, of course, we have to make money, right? So not every piece of functionality will be testing during smoke. Okay, another one. So functional and performance testing are not the same thing. Functional testing is when we make sure that our application functions as expected. So for example, if you're making a purchase, you can go to the application, select the product, make a purchase. Very good. Performance would be make sure that actually the application performs well under certain conditions. So if you, for example, have a low Wi-Fi and you go to your application, part of performance testing would be to make sure that your application actually loads and still works even on low network. So that is a little bit different length. Okay, another one. Is regression testing done after developers update the application? Yes, so regression testing is done after code changes. This is correct. Okay, and one more, are they asking types of testing during interview? They're probably not gonna ask you what is a smoke testing, what is a regression testing. They're probably not gonna ask you something like this, but what they may ask you is what kind of testing, what kinds of testing do you perform, right? And you should be able to mention something like some kinds of testing with example. So you should be definitely able to mention black box. If you know how to work with database or how to do API testing, you can definitely say, I do gray box testing, for example, to verify data is stored in the database properly. You should be able to mention functional testing, non-functional testing, and at least give an example of user interface testing. And you should be able to mention regression and acceptance testing as well. All right, so I see one more, but let me go to the next topic, and hopefully the next topic will actually answer your question. So next one is, let's go here, software development lifecycle. Sorry, here we go. So let me make it a little bit bigger, and let's see. Okay, so software development lifecycle, and actually our role in the whole process of development. So let me make it a little bigger. Hopefully it will be small. Come on, load. Okay, let's do this. So let's talk overall actually about the process and our role in the development process and in the whole like product creation. So I'm going to walk you through this document that I created as an example of the process, so you can explain how things are happening. Just FYI, everything that is highlighted in green is when QA actually gets involved or when QA is needed or should be involved in ideal world. And also, if you see square brackets right here, for example, it means that some stage is not necessary. So it may happen or it may not happen, but I'll talk a little bit about that in details. So first of all, let's talk about overall product development and the development lifecycle. So how everything starts, like from the very beginning. How do we create a product or a feature and so on? Everything starts with an idea, actually. So the first team that is very important for product development is actually the product team. So product team is a team that will generate a lot of ideas or a lot of hypotheses about the product. So hypothesis is basically like some sort of idea that they are not sure about. So let's say you have an onboarding flow when user is registering and you have it on your mobile application, right? So in order to register, your user have to take the mobile device and go through screen 1, screen 2, screen 3, and then after the third screen, user is taken to, let's say, a homepage or something like this, to in-app experience. So product team can come up with idea or hypothesis and say, so how about we actually will be showing users 2 screens instead of 3 screens during registration. And that way, users who have to go only through 2 screens will more likely register and more likely end up in the app and be more involved, right? So hypothesis is this idea like this. They don't know for sure if implementing 2 screens instead of 3 will actually make any difference, but this is just an idea that they may have in mind. So product team generates the ideas, collects them, hypothesis, and then they basically decide themselves which of these ideas they like the most, which of this idea can potentially influence our product in the most positive way. And then they prioritize one of these ideas for implementation. So they're like, okay, looks like this screen modification sounds pretty good. How about we actually try to implement it? And right now we have 3 screens. Let's build 2 screens instead of 3. Let's remove 1 screen. So they select one idea and decide that this is what they're going to implement. Or it can be another feature. It can be anything. So after this, before they go to the engineering, they actually go to designers and they work with design team and create the design for this feature. So, okay, now we have 2 screens instead of 3. How do we still collect the same information? How's design gonna look, right? How we gonna visually show users the information? So they work with designers, and designers will come up with the document that will simply have this screens of the application that are just designed. They're not developed. They just like, this is the document with like, this is how it's visually gonna look. That's it. So designers will come up with this. After design is ready, product team will start working on the, will keep working on the product specifications for this particular feature. And at the same time, they will meet with front-end team, back-end team, ideally QA, also sometimes they forget, and they will show us the ideas that they have with the design, right? So they will like, okay, this is what we used to have, this is what we want to build right now, these are the designs, and these are the things that you basically will be building. Okay, so they meet with the teams, and we all discuss. So what are our initial feedback? For example, it is possible that they will come up with something that is simply a not very good practice to build from the front end perspective, or it's very ambiguous from the QA perspective. Let's say we used to have 3 screens. Now we're going to build 2 screens instead of 3. Me as a QA engineer, the first question I have is like, okay, so we have a user who's currently on the screen number 3. Now user updates our app. Where do we take this user, right? If this screen no longer exists. So something like this. They actually talk, we all talk, and we try to understand how easy it is to build this feature and just provide some feedback. in questions and answer those. So this actually usually is in a few iterations over here, can be a couple meetings, but this is when we decide and when we actually talk about the next feature. After we covered all these cases, after we talked about the feature, product team updates the spec documents. Design gets updated if needed. So if there are any design documents that needs to be updated, they also do that as well. When this is done, when the specs are pretty much ready, at this point, product team will start creating user stories and put them in the backlog. So user stories are basically the description of the desired behavior from user perspective. So as an example, let's see. I have one example here. So this is column application. I just took it from their flow. So imagine they have 3 screens, and now we want to change the experience, get rid of the screen, and only show 2 screens to user. So user story will look like this. As a user, I do not want to see unlock column, so I do not want to see the screen number 2. Or another one, as a user, I want to be taken from onboarding screen 1 to welcome screen, right? So user stories, this very short, usually pretty short descriptions of the functionality from user perspective. So these stories will be created in Jira, and this is what developers will use for work. Until these stories are prioritized, we put them in the backlog. So we just store it in Jira. Its backlog is basically the place where we store all the future work. It's not prioritized to build right now, but sometime we will get to it. So it's just stored in the backlog for now. Now that is there in the backlog. And now we have sprint planning meeting. So sprint planning meeting is a meeting when all engineers we meet and we take the stories or bugs or whatever from the backlog, from all this generic container basically, and we put them into current sprint. So current sprint is usually 2 to 3 weeks process, and sprint is basically a very short period of development. So let's say 2 weeks. So if our sprint is 2 weeks, we will take some user stories, take some bug fixes from the backlog and put them into the current sprint. So we will basically say, okay, during the next 2 weeks, these are the functionality, these are the things that we are going to be working on. So add them to the sprint. Also estimate, right? So during sprint planning, we always estimate, so we know how long it's gonna at least approximately take us to build things and test things. And then the sprint begins. So in the beginning of sprint, first of all, what happens is that at the very beginning, developers will probably spend a couple days, at least 2 to 4 days, just to build a feature to work on some of their tickets. And we usually as QA engineers don't get anything for testing. So first 2 to 4 days, we don't get anything, like any work for testing. But we actually, at this point, we know what kind of stories, what kind of things was prioritized for this sprint, for this next 2 weeks. So we can start working on next QA documentation. So for example, if this is going to be the new feature to be implemented, we can start creating test cases. Or if it's existing change, if it's a change for existing feature, we will start updating our test cases. So we update documentation, they are making the first build. After the first, let's say 2 to 4 days, developers will send us the first build. So the first thing we do when we get this fresh build, we do smoke testing right here. So we want to make sure here that our major functionality is working so we can actually test this application, right? So we take our app, we make sure we can log in, log out, create account, I don't know, make a payment, and so on, like very major components, critical components. So we do them first. And then we usually start to do some exploratory testing for the new feature or for the new change functionality, just quickly going through it, making sure it is actually working. Um, Here, we can also call it sanity. That is totally legit as well. Exploratory is just more detailed usually than sanity. That's why I put exploratory on this document. Um, and then uh, we also get the first few tickets for verification. So let's say our developer finished to work on a certain story. They send this to QA. So now as a QA engineer, I have to actually go to this application and make sure that I only see 2 onboarding screens and they work as expected. We get tickets for verification. After that, usually we have some back and forward with development. And what we do is we report bugs that we find. They will fix the bugs, create a new build, send us a new build, we retest, we'll find another set of bugs, send them that to development. They will fix them, send this to us. Well, you got the idea. So back and forward. This usually happens a lot. It can be 4 times, it can be 5 times, it can be more than that. But basically, they send something to us for testing, we test it, and we send them bug reports. They fix bugs, send them back to us, we verify bugs are fixed, find new bugs, send them to them. So back and forward, like this. So usually by the sometime at the end of the sprint, usually around 4 or 5 days before the end of the sprint, some companies have something that they call code freeze. So code freeze is a day or a stage where they decide, okay, no more major changes will be done to this particular build except for the bug fixes. So developers will still be fixing bugs, but there are going to be no more functionality changes. If, let's say, they work on a certain feature and this feature includes different functionality, this is usually the day where they decide either if the whole feature is not ready, either we only take some piece of this feature and some piece of this functionality to the new build, or we maybe even not release and just extend our timeline because we are behind. So code freeze is usually the stage where we decide, okay, developers are not doing any more changes to the build except for fixing bugs. And approximately at the same time, they create RC or release candidate. So release candidate is just another build. It's just called RC or release candidate because this build has a very high chance of actually going to production, of actually being released. So they start creating the very first build that they will call RC or release candidate build. By this time, this is usually so solid piece of software. After we have our first RC, this is the time where we do regression testing. So at this point, we're gonna go through our whole application and execute all the test cases one after another and go through the whole regression suite. It depends on the product. Regression suite can be 200 test cases, it can be 400 test cases, but basically we will go through each of these test cases, execute them, mark them pass or fail. If we find bugs, we report bugs back to development team. It is possible that there are going to be few release candidates. From my experience, usually I get in good companies, I get a couple of release candidates. So the first one, we find some sort of issue, and then the second one, which is good. If you're less lucky, it is possible you will have 4 or 5 release candidates. So basically until you like polish your build to the point where it's really good to go. Okay, and then also we finish our test cases for the new feature. We like totally finish the testing at this point. So at the very end, like the very last round of regression is basically release acceptance testing, right? So this very last round is when we go through the whole build, execute all the test cases that we have, and make sure our RC, our release candidate build, is acceptable for release. So this is release acceptance testing right here. The last stage, which is, you can probably understand, it's basically the same as here, right? We just call it differently because that's like the final round for release. And at this point, while we are wrapping up our release acceptance testing, our product team prepares release notes or this like short summary of the things that actually have been changed. So they release, so when we release the build, if, for example, it's a mobile application, users will see in the App Store, they will see like, okay, this is build number such and such. Those are the updates, like implemented this functionality, improved this feature, healed some bugs, and so on. That's all going to be in the release notes. Okay, and after this, if everything's fine, we signed off the release. We go ahead and we release our build to production. So after a build has been released to production, don't think that everything is done, that's it. No, after build is released, we also go to production and we do some prod testing. It will depend on actually on your company, how heavily you're going to test in production. But usually you will at least want to make sure that the major functionality is working. So you will at least do smoke testing. You will at least verify that the feature or new changes that were implemented are still there. So at least the sanity check for the new features. But there are definitely companies who will also do the full retesting in production. They will basically go to production and fully execute all the test cases from their regression suite. It is also an option. So some production testing will be done after you release as well. The amount of it really depends on the company and their practices. Then usually we have end of the sprint, and keep in mind that even after you test it in prod, there are still going to be other teams who will likely be monitoring the product, and they will go back to you, get back to you in case something is broken. So really take testing seriously, because if you miss major bugs after you release the builds to production, probably customer success team will be in hell, just because users who find the bugs, if there are a lot of bugs or if there are major bugs, they will be contacting customer success team. So this will be pretty bad influence on them. Also, marketing team will be monitoring your product as well. So if, for example, they are monitoring amount of users on each screen, and all of a sudden they see a drop in a certain flow, they're probably going to raise it and come to an engineering manager asking to make sure that something is not broken. And also product team will continue monitoring reviews. So if users are not happy with the application because it doesn't work properly, your rating on the App Store is going to go down very fast. So this is very negative impact on the product. So product team will definitely be monitoring those as well. And if there are bugs that users are reporting through the reviews, they will go back to you guys and try to verify and ask you to look into the issues. And then at the very end of everything, we will also probably have sprint retro or sprint retrospective. And this is the meeting where we all, like all the engineering product, usually somebody from design as well. We will all meet and we will talk about two major items: what went well, and what are our areas for improvements. So what went well can be things such as, hey, the engineering team created a stable build. There was not that many issues, so the testing was pretty easy. Or, hey, QA team was very fast. Or, hey, product specs were great, right? So those are the positive sides that can come up during the retrospective. Negative sides or areas of improvements are some issues that you faced during the past sprint. And items that can come up here are absolutely different, from broken communication till QA not involved in the story time, like in the meetings when you were talking about the future features, or design not being updated, or development team taking, let's say, 10 days instead of two for the initial development, and then a giant cut for testing times and things like this. So this is a meeting when you all will meet and discuss what went well and what didn't, so you can improve the process for the next time. All right, let me quickly look at the process, at the questions, and then I'll go back to some things that I skipped intentionally. Okay, let's see. So I hope I answered the smoke testing question. Is it done after initial release only? It's right there in the process. Sanity and regression, I think I also mentioned the difference, and when we do each one of them. Is product team meeting is a stakeholder business user. So product team usually is a dedicated team that is responsible for creating some product ideas and generation of these ideas. If you work for a small startup, it is possible they won't have a product team, and they will have some sort of business users, yes, that will basically dictate how the product should be done, which features they need. They are different things. So business people usually are a little bit different from the product team, but it is possible that the company won't have a dedicated team devoted to, like, let's say, ideas and vision only. But product team is more like the team that generates the ideas and has the vision of where your product should be developing. Okay. Let's see what else. So product team is more like a stakeholder rather than a business user, if that makes sense. If this is a new feature, we are not going to have the interface right away, correct? Good question. So for new feature development, most likely backend engineers, if this feature development requires some backend engineering, like some data being sent to the backend, stored in the database and whatever, backend engineers will likely build backend first, and then they will bring it to the front-end engineers, and they will build the interface. So as a manual QA engineers, usually you test when feature is being done or delivered by the actual front-end team. So at that point, the backend component has been implemented, you have the interface, so you work within the interface. At the same time, it is possible to only test backend component without interface. If you go into API testing direction, or if you learn API testing, you will know how to do that and how to test something without interface. But usually, if we're talking just about generic process, and my particular example, QA role here will appear after you have the interface to work with. So you will just be interacting with the app. Okay, what else? Which testing will be created faster, Agile or Scrum? I can't answer this question. In my opinion, it really depends on the team you're working with. Because I've been working in Scrum teams, they seemed a little bit faster to me than Agile. But at the same time, I've been also working in a couple of Agile teams that were so slow that it is hard to even imagine, and they claim to be Scrum, which was just weird. So can't answer really. In real life, it really depends more on the team than on the processes they are following. Whatever works better for them. Okay, when we do requirement mapping. So if you are creating test cases based on requirements, you're basically going to do it right here at this stage while developers are still developing the initial build. Okay, another one, let's see. If you have 4 or 5 RCs, you started to test them, and the first one is quite good. Okay, so if we have one RC, we test it, and it's good, that's it. We don't create more RCs, right? So when I'm saying that we have 4 or 5 RCs, they go one after another. So we only have 5 release acceptance builds in case the fourth one wasn't good enough, right? So if the first one is good, okay, we stop there. We don't create any more release candidates. If the second one is good, okay, then the second one is the final one. It's not like you have 5 different options. No, they one after another. Okay, let's see what else. If application rate goes down, is this affects straight whom exactly and which way? So if your review rate on the store goes down, it is usually a negative impact for the product, because less users will download this application, less users will interact with this, potentially less revenue, less money, right? So this is the dependency that we have. Of course, nobody's gonna probably fire you for missing a bug, but at the same time, it is pretty visible who missed a certain issue. So for example, if you are responsible for testing, let's say, account functionality, and there is a major bug that would lead to the case where account page doesn't even open, it is pretty clear that you probably didn't open account page as well when testing it, right? But at the same time, if you are testing account functionality, everything is fine, you release, and then in production, all of a sudden account functionality is broken, but in your testing environment, it is still fine, and you obviously tested and it was fine, then the issue is definitely somewhere in the environmental differences. Then it's more on the development and infrastructure team to figure out what the problem is. Again, nobody's going to get fired, but it doesn't feel well, trust me. Okay, so let's move on, and a few more things I want to mention here. So first of all, I missed the hotfix. So what are hotfixes and when they happen? Imagine that you are releasing the mobile application, and let's say you release the mobile application, everything works fine, except for one thing. For example, one page doesn't open for users, and this is not like a critically important page. This can be something relatively small. For example, the page with, let's say, user information, like the user address or something like this, for an application that is, let's say, banking, right? So yeah, it is important to fix, but at the same time, users can still make payments, use your banking application without even seeing that address screen, without needing to see that address screen. But still, you want to fix it, and you want to fix it quickly. So hotfix is basically a build with one fix. So what we're gonna do, we released, and then we're like, oh, oops, we basically we missed something. Most likely it's gonna come from customer success team because users will start complaining. At least one will. And at this point, what you're gonna do is like, first of all, you're gonna decide how you're gonna go around this bug. Do you wanna wait another 2 weeks for the next sprint, or do you want to just fix the issue right away? And if the decision to fix the issue right away is made, then basically what will be done is that a developer will take the current build, do only one change. They will make only one change. They will only make one bug fix for this particular screen, for example. Then they will send this build to QA. We will verify this fix, and we will probably do some very high-level generic sanity testing plus smoke testing. Maybe we will even start doing regression, but highly unlikely we will have enough time to go through whole regression suite. We will verify it's fixed. We will tell developers, hey, this is fixed, we verify that, and then they will make another release with this one fix only. So a new build appears, one fix only. We are still continuing to testing. Build's already released, but we can still continue testing just to make sure that nothing else is broken. So hot fix, one build with usually one fix, and we just push it so we quickly fix this experience for users. All right, let's see what else. So another thing is, for example, revert. So revert happens when you are testing something, and let's say you are releasing your application, and then you notice that your application all of a sudden is totally broken in production, and it's broken to the point where users cannot even use its major features, or users can't register, or users create account. Sorry, let me check. Actually, 1 second. And things like this. So if that is the case, basically you want to, if that is the case, basically you want to go back, right? You want to revert your application and make sure that the application users get to the previous version of the application. So revert is when we release something, looked at it in production, understood that it is broken, and then basically we went back, right? So revert is basically rolling back to the previous version. And let's say now our users used to have version 3, we just released version 4, we found out that version 4 is super broken, we got back to version 3, this is revert. So users are still seeing previous version, and we are looking into version 4 and trying to understand what happened, why is this so broken. So usually reverts don't happen often. From my experience, they usually are very unlikely, but they might happen when there is a difference between environments and something goes wrong during the actual release process, unfortunately. Okay, very cool. Let me quickly check the questions and talk about A/B tests. Got it. Okay. So next thing that I want to mention here is possible A/B split or A/B testing, what it is and why we need it. So first of all, A/B testing is not something that every company uses, but some of them will actually use A/B testing. So what is A/B testing? Imagine you are a product manager and you have a hypothesis, and your hypothesis is like, I have 3 screens now. How about I only have 2 instead of 3? And if that's the case, I will have more users in my beautiful applications. More users will actually be interacting with applications, buying something, and so on. This is a hypothesis. I don't know for sure if users gonna like 2 screens over 3 screens, or if they not, right? I have no idea. I can maybe like just have some generic idea about it, but I cannot say for sure, right? So now the question is, how do we find out? Will the users like 2 screens more, or will the users like 3 screens more? How do we measure? So for this purpose, we actually have thing that is called A/B testing. So A/B testing is not a testing that is done by QA engineers at all. A/B testing is a technique that usually is applied by product managers. And this is the ability to break our application into 2 or more variants for the users, and then observe which variants our users like more. So in this particular case, what we can do here, we can take this old version that is 3 screens, and then we can also create the second version that is 2 screens, and then we can only release this version to 50% of our users. So 50% of our users will still see the old one, and another 50% of the users will see the new one, the new version of the application. And then we just watch these users. We watch them for, let's say, a month or maybe 2 months, and we measure how many users are ending up being in the application, how many of them are making purchases. Is A flow more successful than B flow? So A usually is the legacy or initial flow, and B is usually the variant. So in this example, we used to have 3 screens, so 3 screens would be A flow, old flow. B flow is the new flow with 2 screens, right? So on a high level, this is another example of A/B testing. So A/B testing, for example, for web can be done like this. We will show 50% of user, we will show the green block on the right side, and 50% of user will see a blue block on the left side, right? And then we will compare the conversion or engagement of the users and see which one is better. So in this example, we can see that, okay, more users actually are liking this version, so we will keep this version, we will get rid of this variant. So obviously the issue starts with testing, because, hey, now we actually have to test 2 things instead of 1. First of all, when the new build is created, this build will have 2 options, option A and option B. We can force a certain option to be visible to us through certain internal tools, or developers sometimes they even like add the toggles for you, so you can go to the build and select like A flow and you will see A flow, or select B flow and you will see B flow. But now we have to test both versions, so keep this in mind if your company is using A/B testing. Probably there are going to be more testing, because you have to test old flow and the new flow, make sure that old flow wasn't broken and the new flow is working. And also the testing can get really complicated if, let's say, they have 10 A/B tests at the same time. Just imagine that it is a giant amount of permutations of users seeing A flow, B flow, B flow, and so on, right? Just imagine 10 possible tests can really change users' flow very, very much. So it is a good practice not to have a lot of A/B tests at the same time. Also, some companies really break it, so just keep it in mind. And usually there is some rule made around A/B testing and the QA, how they cover it with tests, like some policy. I've seen companies where the QA engineers will only test A flow, and bflow is never tested by QA engineers, but bflow is released, let's say, to 5% of users, then to 10% of users, then to 20, and only if everything is fine and users are not reporting bugs, then it's released to 50%. So bflow can be like literally not covered with testing. That is also an option. So the rules around this really are established by the company, but keep in mind that if company has A/B testing, this is what's happening. They might have different flow variants that they will show you to users in order to measure the success of one flow over another one. Okay, let's see what else. Let me go through questions and then we'll go back to the slides. How many hotfixes are considered normal during 2 weeks? None. So hotfix means a release, right? It means that you release to production and then found a bug to the point where you want to fix this bug right away, and you want to make another quick release with one bug fix only, which usually is a quite serious bug, right? So usually no hot fixes is a good practice. From my experience, I've seen 2 hot fixes over the last year and a half. So it's quite rare. Okay. And also it doesn't look good for users. Imagine you have a mobile application and then you just updated it and the next day it has another update, right? It's just like, okay, what's wrong with this? Why? So it's not a good thing. All right, what else? Is A/B testing common? And another question, is A/B testing mostly relates to UI or functionality as well? Oh my God, this is a great one. So A/B testing is pretty common in larger companies. So if you go to Facebook, Google, Amazon, and so on, they definitely will be running A/B tests. Probably multiple A/B tests on the same page. All right, they find for clicks. For startups, smaller company, A/B testing usually is not so common. And another one, A/B testing doesn't always relate to UI. Sometimes A/B testing is basically relates to UI. That's the ideal case. That's what it should be used for. Mostly it should be used for user interface. Like, do users like this text or do they like this text? Do they like this button or do they like this button? That's the ideal scenario, and that's what A/B testing should be usually used for. But some companies also use A/B testing for features. So my example with screens, like, do users like 2 screens or do they like 3 screens? That is a functionality change. So that's releasing functionality change under A/B testing. I personally think it's not a good practice, but it is possible that you will face something like this. Okay, cool. Cool. And let's see the last one. Is new update for application comes after acceptance testing? Yes, so there is a round of release acceptance testing, then build is released, and then you see the update on your app. Except cases when it's a hotfix. Okay, cool. Let's see what else. Actually, let me go back to this part, and then if we have more questions, if we have more time, I'll answer the remaining ones. I tried to cover most of them, but let's quickly look one more time. So remaining a few interview questions related to today's topic, really quickly, because I covered most of them. What kinds of testing do you perform? Black box, sometimes gray box if you're doing API testing or database related testing. We perform functional testing. We also perform non-functional testing, especially related with graphical user interface. So very fine colors, very fine fonts, very fine alignments and designs, right? We do regression, we do smoke, we do release acceptance. You can also mention that you do sanity. majority of the people are going to mix up sanity and smoke. So if you just mention smoke, it's fine. Okay, what else? What is a hot fix? I just mentioned, basically releasing a new build with one bug fix only. What is rollback revert? Going to the previous version if things are absolutely broken. Question number 4. What would you do if there is no documentation or requirements? How would you test it? So today, I've actually mentioned a few things. So there are user stories that can be created in Jira. There are design documents. There are product documents. So if somebody is asking you this question, basically tell first of all, that you need to make sure that there are actually no documentation. Because everywhere I go, even if they claim that there is no documentation at all, they will at least have design, right? So how would you test if there is no documentation or requirements? First of all, I will actually go through existing documentation. I will go through design documents. I will go through Jira just to make sure there are actually really no documentation. I will ask product managers because maybe they have a PRD, but it's like somewhere in the Google Doc and it's just not shared with me, right? So first of all, I will still search for the requirements. Then if there are no requirements like at all, I can't find anything, I can do some exploratory testing. And I can do testing based on similar products, right? So for example, if my application is supposed to take, for example, take a picture of the credit card and input the credit card number for payment automatically, I can find another similar application in the App Store that does the same exact thing, download it, verify how things are done in that application, and then basically come up with some test cases for my own, right? Just use example. And obviously use common sense because we as users are pretty familiar with what we would expect from the application. Okay, question number 5. When do we stop testing? So a few scenarios. First of all, when we go through our test cases, we execute all the test cases, and we basically completed everything that we've outlined, so we can stop testing here. Second case is when we actually have a deadline. So imagine that you are working on a project and you really have to release on a certain date because you have clients waiting for this release, or maybe it's a public release that is promoted all over the marketing campaign on TV, everywhere, right? So you must release on a certain date. So no matter what and how it's going on, you're going to release that day. So basically, you're going to test up till that day, and then you will release, right? So that is another example when we stop testing. Another approach is, let's say you have a mobile application and you can really test it for a very, very long period of time because you can test your application with Wi-Fi, without Wi-Fi. You can do some interruption testing when somebody calls you during using the application, and so on and so on. So there are a lot of things you can actually keep on doing, and a lot of versions of operation system, right? For Android, we have Android, for example, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All those are valid cases, right? We can keep on testing pretty much forever, but we stop testing when we understand that no additional testing will significantly increase our knowledge about product quality. So if you know that 90% of your users are on these operation systems, no need to test like very low levels and so on, right? You cover most of the cases. Also executing the majority of the test cases that you have outlined in the regression suite, basically executing all the test cases in the regression suite is definitely good. No need to create a lot of edge cases, like how would my application behave under super low network, right? You can do this kind of test a couple times, no need to spend all your time with this. So when you realize that no additional testing will significantly improve your knowledge about product quality, is also time to stop testing. And last one, question number 6. We have 2 hours to execute 30 test cases. How would you do this? Right? It's similar to what I just explained. First of all, is 2 hours enough to execute 30 test cases or not? If it is enough, then it's okay. We just start with most positive test cases. We execute them first, and then we execute the rest of the test cases. If 2 hours is not enough time to execute the 30 test cases and you are limited in time, you start testing with the most positive functional test cases. They go first, and then all the negative cases, edge cases, they go to the end. You start testing with the most popular platforms, and then less popular platforms go next, right? If 90% of your users are on Android, start with Android. Start with major functionality such as user creation, login, payment, whatever your app is doing, and then go to the negative test cases such as user cannot register without entering, for example, email address. Yes, it is important, but it is less important than the rest of your functionality of your app. Okay, so I hope it makes sense. Let me look at the rest of your questions and we will wrap up. Okay. Let me go from the beginning, also make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. All right. So looks good overall. Okay. So let's start. Let's start with this one. How many people are usually in the team? How many QA and developers? Really depends on the team and really depends on the company. A common practice, if you, let's say, work on a pretty small project, it is possible that there are going to be a couple QA engineers, 4 developers, let's say a couple iOS developers, couple Android developers, maybe 1 backend developer, 1 designer, 1 product manager, right? Like very small team, that is pretty possible. It is also possible that you will only be working on a team with QA engineers. So there are a lot of jobs, especially contract roles, where there is basically a team of QA engineers only, and you don't interact with developers personally pretty much at all. All you do is like you get a build, you are sent a build, and then you have the test cases to execute. You open this build, you execute test cases. If there is a bug, you report the bug. Then after you're done, you can be sent another build or even different applications. So people who work on the projects, that's basically how they work. They have the members of QA team sitting near them, and they don't interact with developers at all. They just file bugs. And then when developers fix something, they will get like the actual fixes, and they don't have like developer on their team. It's just a team of QAs. That is also possible for large projects. Okay. Let's see what else. Do you think any question regarding A/B testing or hot fixes can be asked in the interview? We had somebody who was asked what is a hot fix, so it obviously can be asked. Regarding A/B testing, somebody can ask you like, are you familiar with A/B testing? Have you had experience with A/B testing? It's okay if you say no. You can absolutely legit. You can say no, we actually didn't do this in our previous project. But you can definitely mention that. I mean, I know what it is, and it just means that I will need to test more variants. That's basically it. Okay, let's see what else. Is there any minimum time frame in testing a project that is given to us at work? Again, really depends on the company and the project. Usually, sprint is 2 weeks, right? So a couple of weeks is probably yes for testing a small feature, or even pretty large feature. If you have a team of, let's say, 3 QA engineers on one large feature, it's pretty easy to cover. So a couple of weeks, but can be more. The bigger project is, the bigger feature is, it can turn into months as well. Okay, let's see what else. So the question there, somebody's asking the question about not being able to update an app, especially with Google Play. Android is its own land. So it is possible that if you're on Android, and especially on older version of Android, some developers will not be testing on it at all. And they will just release. And then if users can't update, user will report an issue. And some developers or some smaller apps don't even care about, like, older versions. So you won't be able to update. I've seen those. Unfortunately, it is possible with Android. And I don't know what will help here. If restarting didn't help, not sure what else can you do here with such apps. Also, from my observation, when you release an Android app update to the market, you can also limit the amount of users who can update. So let's say only certain percentage, like only 20% of your users will only be able to update, the rest will not. That is actually a setting that you can pick under Google Play Market when releasing. It is possible too. Okay, let's see what else. In your opinion, what do you expect from your manual QA if they're doing the job exceptionally well? That's my personal opinion. That is, like, just to clarify, that's only my personal opinion. I'll just provide that. Many people probably will disagree, but I'm very technical myself, and I would expect people to be, like, for me, the exceptionally well means somebody who is also pretty technical, and somebody who can actually, if finding a bug, understand if this issue is on the front end or on the back end, and go to a proper developer and describe the bug correctly. Because, for example, when I report a bug, it usually contains half of the solution for a developer on how to fix it. I don't expect this from everyone, but at least some hints in which side to go to for developers, that would be helpful. And exceptionally well for me is when a manual QA engineer can also test APIs with Postman. That, I think, is a very good and solid level that not many people have, actually. Can verify things in the database is also good. But again, majority of people will probably disagree with me, and majority of people will probably mention that exceptionally well also means a giant, a very high communication skill, and a great communication, and the ability to actually explain the problem very well to everybody else. Maybe it is a combination of those, but that is also a common opinion. All right, cool. Let's see what else, and we can wrap it up. Okay, so let me actually cover one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. So one more thing is the question that I see here. I think actually a couple people asked it. So what to do and what to tell in case you don't know something during the interview, right? So If you are asked about some sort of technology that you are not familiar with, let's say, do you have any experience working with such, or do you know what it is? You can definitely say something like, I did not have such experience, or I did not work with this technology yet. Also, I would like to learn it, right? If they ask you something more specific to the things that you should know, like for example, which information would you put into a bug report in this, and you really don't know, if that's the case, try to come up with something, like try to think logically and try to explain how would you at least start taking approach, and what would you do in such and such situation. That will be helpful, right? So if they're asking you about technology, just it's okay, tell them that you are not familiar but you'd like to learn it. If they're asking you a question that you're really not familiar with, and it's like more of a behavioral kind of thing, or what would you put in a bug report, test case, and whatever, try to just use common sense and at least start answering it. Also, sometimes if you don't know, you can definitely say it, but give them some idea of where you would think. So for example, they would ask you like, so what is the difference between testing Android application and iOS application? Probably you don't know really, but you can at least start thinking logically, and you can probably say something like, well, Android definitely has a few buttons on the bottom that are clickable, right? iOS doesn't have these buttons, especially back button. So when testing on iOS, we definitely have to make sure that users should be able to navigate back. When testing on Android, we should also test this button on the bottom of the screen, right? iOS and Android, they actually have different styles, just styles of the whole operation system. So the styles of our application should actually reflect probably, right, the style of the platform. Would be nice to test against that as well, right? So just give some ideas, like start maybe discussing, or like give some generic information, where you would start from. And then most likely the interviewer will gonna help you or just give you some ideas, right? So just try to say something to break the ice, and it is very possible that it will turn into a better conversation from there, and you'll actually come up with something. All right, so I hope this is helpful. Thank you guys. Those are great questions. I really like them. Again, if you have any more, bring them in tomorrow. We definitely try to cover everything else and wrap it up. And have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.